Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I am going to have a hard start at 10 a.m. today, so we're going to go straight into it. We still have a few people joining, but I want to cover quite a bit today, so I'm going to go right ahead. Once again, thank you for joining. We've had quite a few regulars, and I'm really hoping that this Toolbox series is accomplishing what I hoped it would, which would be to provide you with a platform where we could speak to seasoned professionals and get insight and experts on some of the current regulatory topics. And as you would know, we've done one session so far on careers and compliance. And with this session today, I'm going to do a blended approach where we're going to hear from our guests, tapping into looking at some regulatory matters, but then just tapping in from her years of experience, her own personal insights as to how she thinks we can all advance our compliance careers. So without further ado, it's really a privilege and pleasure to introduce somebody who has had a profound impact, not only on financial services regulations in the BVI, but also on many of us personally within the compliance community. And that is none other than Mrs. Yolanda McCoy. As many of you will know, Mrs. McCoy retired from the BVI FSC, having served as Deputy Director for Prudential Supervision within the Authorization and Supervision Division. Prior to joining the Commission in 2007, she had already built a strong foundation as a long-standing banker. Over the course of more than 17 years in financial services regulation, she held a number of senior roles, including responsibility for compliance inspections and later serving as Deputy Director in the Banking, Insolvency and Fiduciary Services Division, where I first met her, before moving into her substantive supervisory leadership role. However, Mrs. McCoy's titles alone do not capture her contribution. On a personal note, Mrs. McCoy was very instrumental in my own compliance and regulatory journey in the BVI. She operated with what I can describe as an open line policy. Not only I, but many colleagues across the industry could pick up the phone to seek guidance on complex compliance or regulatory matters. What stood out was not just her technical competence, which is unquestionable, but her willingness to explain, to teach, and to ensure that you truly understood the issue at hand. She had a way of breaking down regulatory expectations in a manner that was practical, clear, and grounded in supervisory reality. I learned a lot from her approach, particularly the importance of balancing firmness and standards with fairness in engagement. And throughout it all, and we all know Mrs. McCoy, she was consistently warm, approachable, and generous with her time. Today's conversation is therefore not only about inspection findings and regulatory expectations, it is also about drawing on the experience of someone who has shaped supervisory practice in this jurisdiction and mentored many compliance professionals along the way. Mrs. McCoy, I thank you for your service, your leadership, and the many lessons you have shared with us, and I am truly delighted to have you with us today.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Tammany, for that introduction. It's really been a pleasure to be with you this morning. As I mentioned, you have taken me out of my comfort zone, but here we are.
Thank you so much, and thank you for agreeing to participate. I know it's out of your comfort zone, but so many of us are so eager, to continue hearing from you. So to set the background, I figured the best place to start off would be for you to share a bit about your journey in the banking service prior to joining the commission and what actually drew you to a career with the commission.
Interesting. Okay, I started at the bank fresh out of school, actually. And I started as a cashier at Chase Manhattan Bank. And just like the young people today, I was curious and I wanted to know more. And from the cashier position, I moved on to several positions in the bank, all the way to managing the branch, I also included being a compliance officer for the bank, as well as the operations manager. And quite frankly, the operations portion of my job was the part that I liked best. But having said that, it was a journey, and actually preparing for this session, I look back and I said to myself, what a journey. But here we are today, and I'm happy to share that experience with you. In terms of, moving from the bank to the commission, I was always intrigued with what was going on in the commission. Everyone looked so um, professional. They also carry that air of authority, and I wanted to be a part of that. In the bank, I was focused mainly on what is happening in a particular organization. But moving to the commission, I had an opportunity to be a part of what was happening in the jurisdiction. So that really, sort of drive me to live in the bank. And apart from that, being at the bank, my name was synonymous with the bank, and I wanted to get away from that. So I went back to school and got my qualifications. And the day that I graduated, I said, okay, this is my turn, and I'm going to apply. So it took some years before I decided to make that move, because you can imagine, while I admire the folks at the commission, I realized that these were young professionals with their degrees. And while I had many, many years of experience, I needed to get that degree. So it took some time. It didn't happen overnight. And that is one of the things I want to say today, that stay focused on what you want to do and work towards it. It will not happen overnight, but it will happen.
And I think that's, a good example of a remarkable journey, because as you've mentioned, your name was synonymous with the bank, but equally, and you've mentioned you started, at the commission later after then doing your qualifications and then going to the commission, and your name is synonymous with the commission as well. So I think you've done a really good job with that. And for the younger persons on this platform, or not only younger persons who may be more mature, but in a younger stage of your professional career, I think, what's important is that it can be done. Once you put your mind to it, you get the qualifications and you have the right mindset to pursue. Now, one of the things I think that's very admired with your background, you've done banking, then you went into fiduciary and compliance inspections. So you've really seen a wide breadth of the regulatory landscape. And how did that journey going through all of these areas, really help you on the inspections as well?
Well, working across divisions and, from the private sector then into the commission, it eliminated the tunnel vision, if I may use that term. In banking, for example, you learn about liquidity and credit risk, those type of things. In fiduciaries, the fiduciary supervision exposes structural complexities and beneficial ownership risk. In compliance, it revealed the operational reality behind the policies. So, the breadth shaped my mindset, because as we know, risk really sits in one silo. So going to the commission from banking and into the regulatory environment, there were things from the bank I see from that side, and then on the regulatory side. So I meshed the two, and it helped me to better supervise the banks helped me supervise the fiduciary, and in terms of inspection, I understood what was happening with the business. So even though it was banking, it's the business. And so that really helped me seeing the three sections: banking, fiduciary, and the inspections.
Okay, that's very helpful. And looking at the financial services environment back then, and even back then, over those years, it has changed. It has had so many versions, so many different themes to where it is now. How different is it from now compared to those various journeys back then?
Well, do we have the time? Honestly, the change has been tremendous. I recall when in the bank, money was a word, and laundering was another word. But putting the two together was never something that we heard about. And so it's just amazing to look back at what was then and what it is right now. And one of the things that definitely has changed is the technology. The speed at which things are done now compared to when I started at the bank, even as recent as the commission, it's unbelievable. And so this is something that we need to recognize. We need to understand that we are in an ever-changing world, and it will continue to change. And those people who survive would be the ones that are willing to adapt and to change with the changes.
And I think that it's a good point. I mean, I know we're going to go into the inspections, but just touching on for compliance professionals, the reason why it's so important to also be adaptable, to always, look at not just what are emerging risks, but what are the technologies that are out there. We can't turn a blind eye to it. We have to continuously be curious to understand those risks. You can't be rigid at all. And I can imagine at the commission too, my understanding, there's a lot of now reg tech, that sort of technology, new technology from a regulatory perspective. So that on one hand can make certain parts of regulation maybe easier, but then it also, just getting used to that change of where there was a way of doing things methodically to identify deals, and probably now everything can just be streamlined. That took some change as well for you within the commission.
It did. It certainly did. Every year almost there's changes in the legislation. You have to adapt to those. The international benchmarks are moving consistently. Every day almost, you can see. And we have to adapt to those changes. It's no point of looking back and say, well, when I started, 20, 30 years ago, this is what it was. That's history. And so we need to, as I mentioned, need to adapt to the changes and move with it.
And so what would be, in terms of your view, has been the most significant shift both regulators and the regulated entities have had to navigate, especially with all of these AML, CTF, expectations?
Well, it continues to be a challenge because, as I mentioned, the international benchmarks continue to move. And actually, my heart aches for entities that have been around for some time because, they did things a certain way based on what was available then. And now they're finding themselves having to change because the regulations, the benchmarks have changed. So it's never ending. And I see it from when I did inspections. Especially the long-standing licensees, they might have been perfect 10 years ago, but if they didn't change with the change, then that's a real issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. And particularly not only and I think the issue from a commercial perspective, the bigger ones, the legacy ones who would have
Mhm.
larger volumes to remediate with the shifting tides, you're now looking at whether they have the resources, either investing in human or now technology in terms of resources to help them remediate and upskill to whatever the new benchmarks are. And just more from a consultant's level. And I think what we're naturally seeing in the industry, then you may have mergers, you may have acquisitions, takeovers, you're seeing persons coming out of the market, which I think when you look at it holistically, it's part of the industry, it's part of that's just how society also works. If you don't have the proper systems in place, you either get squeezed out. I mean, it's not what we want, but I think, for a lot of the firms, it's a matter of also having to decide how to adjust themselves and how to pivot to either comply or change their business model if needed in a way that helps them to comply. So I think even you're seeing a lot of changes in the landscape, and you would have been part of on the fiduciary side dealing with the mergers and the acquisitions. And I remember my experience also with you, where now looking at, well, the new surviving entity, who's going to have transfer of those files and how does that take place? There's a lot in that landscape at the moment. Right now, we can pivot, as you've mentioned, inspections, and that's the current regulatory hot topic for, I would say, from last year to this year, following the mutual evaluation. The national AML strategy also for this year is also focusing on more inspections. Maybe we can also just touch on why are inspections also so important for the regulator. I mean, we know the natural answer, but what is happening in the background, with the information, and how does that help the regulator in terms of determining what happens next in terms of prudential supervision?
Well, I can't speak for what's happening there now. It's been 2 years
Correct, yes.
since I'm out. However, inspections generally is very important for the commission. The commission wants to see, and the licensees too should be in a position where they should view the inspections as validation to what they have put in place, what they are doing. And the commission, from my view, doesn't want a situation where we catch you. The commission wants to know that they have a jurisdiction that's properly regulated. They understand what is happening in there, and if there are weaknesses in those entities where it can be corrected, because one of the main purposes of the commission is to safeguard the reputation of the Virgin Islands. And we know that once reputation is lost, it's very difficult to build that reputation again. So, they really need to be able to show that they are understanding what's happening in the industry. Because you can send beautiful reports to the commission, to anybody that you're required to, but as we said, the proof is in the pudding is in the eating it. So you definitely need to go and say, yes, we have reviewed X amount, and these are our findings. And honestly, from doing inspections, when I was doing inspections, I like to see a good report. When you see inspections that there are a number of contraventions, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for the commission. It's a challenge for the entity. It's a challenge for the board. It's a challenge all around. So, by doing inspections, it shows that the commission is, going in to understand what is really happening and to report that, yes, we have done this and this is what we have seen.
Thank you for this. And having led many compliance inspections back then, And I know, things may have changed, but back then, what was some of the common weaknesses you would consistently see across the different types of licensees you would inspect?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I haven't been in the inspection area for 10 years, and I'm sure I understand that Tashel, who's in charge of that area now, was one of your guests. So she may have pointed you in those directions. However, what I would say, 10 years ago, I don't suspect that some of the findings that we had then would be there up to today. That would certainly not speak well of the jurisdiction.
Mhm.
However, things that can still be an issue is risk assessments, for example. That is almost the word that is commonly spoken about, the first word actually talking about AML. We all know that resources are limited, and risk assessment is very important so that you focus your efforts in where the risks lie. So that is one of the areas that perhaps could still be a weakness, where risk assessments are not completed or not done with the importance that it should have. Another area that I want to mention is the compliance manuals. Although, like I say, after 10 years, I'm sure that they're much better. But one of the things that was quite obvious, I recall, there were manuals that was pretty much copy and paste.
I remember that 10 years ago seeing that a lot.
Yeah.
They would circulate amongst the industry and with the footers or people forgetting to change out.
And in some manuals you might have license A, but in your manual you are referring to a different type of license.
Correct.
So that is something that, I think licensees should pay attention to. Then another area would be weak ongoing monitoring documentation. If you're monitoring, document it. It's not, and make your records, because you don't want to have to prepare records 2-3 months, a year after. Nobody will believe you at that point. So if you're going to monitor, and you don't need to do that, make sure that it's documented. And one of the other challenges, and I'm sure again that this has been rectified, the poor evidence of funds or wealth, the source of funds or wealth. But I'm sure that your
I'm
clients.
sorry to disappoint you, but just speaking from the consultant's background, where we're seeing, just from what we're observing, and, I think it'll be good for persons on the call. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in a lot of inspection reports that we come across helping clients is the customer risk assessment not being adequate, not considering all of the risk factors that the code says you need to consider. And exactly as you mentioned, to the ongoing monitoring still needs a lot of work. What we're identifying amongst, reading quite a bit of inspection reports, both on the FIA and FSC side, that still seems to unfortunately be a deficiency with a few licensees, and the ongoing monitoring and the documenting and using the triggers. And I think more so demonstrating screening, what is adequate screening for your ongoing monitoring. The compliance manuals, I can say, I think they've improved. I don't think we're seeing templates. I'm not sure if the commission still is, but I recall, particularly earlier in my career when I first started in the BVI, the templates that would go around And it was you, Mrs. McCoy, who would always say your manual has to reflect your procedure. Your manual is it's the testing safeguard. It's what the commission is going to test you against. So, it has to reflect your procedure. So I think there've been some improvements, but I think there's still some areas that we're seeing within the industry, the risk-based approach not being properly followed. And as you've mentioned, the verification of source of funds and source of wealth not being adequate depending on the risk assessment of the client. So where there were higher risk clients, you're not seeing the source of funds and source of wealth. But I think there's been a lot of outreach as well, with the commission also publishing a lot of guidance notes. So I'd encourage participants on this call to ensure you're reading these guidance notes and learning from peers as well in terms of what their inspection experience is, so that you can try to update it. In terms of this one will be interesting, because I think back then, Mrs. McCoy, there were more on-site inspections. I think aside from resources, and there's so many inspections to be done, there's a lot of off-site at the moment. But I recall, back then, you were a lot of on-site inspections when the team comes and they're with you for a week or so, and it will be, whole scope inspections. But what would be, because of that interaction, what would you say from your experience would be some behavioral red flags that you may see with the compliance officer or board, or just what you're seeing in that moment that would go, I need to look into this? And I suspect that's where you'd be asking for the board minutes, but let me.
Yes, definitely. Well, one of the things that would always strike me when I would do inspections, if there's the compliance officer, the directors become defensive. We were not there to, I got you. We were there to validate what you're doing. And so once they become defensive, then you need to start to look deeper. You say, okay, I need to look deeper. And in the files, for example, too, you would see there were unusual willingness to bend the rules. And I can understand where you would have a long-time client. The AML only came in effect in 2008, but I mean the regulations and the policies were there. And you might have a long time license. You might have a long-term client who would be putting up obstacles in your way from getting these things. And when you see on the files your willingness always to bend the rules, instead of trying to get them to understand the reason. And quite frankly, some of the clients that you have, if you consistently need to bend the rules, do you really want them as clients? I mean, really? And another thing that would be a red flag for us would be the reluctance to disclose issues proactively. You may have an issue, and the commission only know about it once they get in there. The compliance officers, they need to make sure that they proactively report to the commission. Yes, it might trigger an inspection, but you have another pair of eyes looking at what the issues could be or maybe. So you want to be able to proactively disclose issues. So, you don't want the commission to come in and find. If the commission goes in and finds something wrong, but if you should have known, or you did know and didn't proactively report it, then we're going to look a little bit deeper. So
Yeah. And I think sometimes the challenge for some compliance officers is they may have a willingness to want to report it. And it may not be something that's a significant breach or something that requires that disclosure under the code, but you want to report it, and then the board somewhat, stops you that no, this is not going to be reported, etc. And how do you think a compliance officer can navigate that to cover themselves still?
Well, the key is to document, document, document. If it's not written, you know the saying, it was not done. You think it was not done. So you write to the board, you have it documented. You should have board minutes that show that there were discussions and what came out of it. And maybe they had good reason, and it should be documented. So that is one of the defenses that you would have, to have them properly documented, because the board minutes are reviewed, and you'd want to see what the discussions are like, what they were like pertaining to AML, to the business in a whole. So, I know that it's a challenge for compliance officers, because the board, they have to report it to the board. But whatever I say related to the compliance officer in terms of being proactive, I say to the board as well. Because at the end of the day, the board really is the one responsible for compliance. So they should want to be in a position where they have reported whatever it might be proactively. And, in my time at the commission, we've seen this. They've been consistent engagements, and people, they do report things that they should, that came to light. However, if during inspections you find things and you want to know why this was not reported, and maybe there's good reason, and we might disagree or agree with them, but you want to err on the side of caution. So report proactively.
And I think the takeaway too for compliance officers on this call would be to at least also then document that you have, whether it's by email or even it's a memo that you send by email that has outlined what the issue is, what the law is on it, or what the requirements, or what your procedure says on it, and what you recommend. And I think that's important, what your recommendation is, so that you have documented that. So if your recommendation was that, as much as it's not something under a significant breach or significant disclosure, rather, that has to immediately be reported, for whatever reason you believe that this should nevertheless be something that is disclosed with a remediation framework, you can at least put that in. If the board then decides, and in some instances, as much as what I find you see happening here, the compliance officer is reporting to the board, but on the day-to-day, they may be reporting just to the MD. So you may have an ability, you've sent that email attaching your memo to your board, or you may have sent it to your MD, who, whether the MD's decided not to forward it on or not. But I think what's important is you have to demonstrate that you have. If the commission comes in, you can say, I did. And you need to have a genuine, I think what we also have to remember is you have to have effective compliance. You need to have a genuine approach to it. Cannot also just be, well, I send this to the board, I send this to the MD, and they didn't, they did whatever they want, I'm fine. And because I found over the course of my career, you also find certain compliance attitudes in that way. And for full disclosure, I remember very early on, I had a similar approach, and it didn't last long, probably once, where it was, well, I reported it to the board, and they decided whatever. If the commission comes in, I'm fine. I did whatnot. And I was told, they asked me, they said, well, was that effective compliance on your end? And that was a takeaway for me. And why I'm sharing that, to participants is, that it's not just tick the box. I told the board they didn't take me on and my back is covered. You have a duty to safeguard the institution. And I do appreciate for some people that duty is really curtailed depending on the type of board that you have. But you then also have to come up with other ways to figure out how to skin the cat. You know, that's the short of it. You can't just also say, I did X, they didn't do Y. And I can't say how the commission would view that, but you know, just from a sensible approach, I think, you know, I'm just thinking, I'm not a regulator. A regulator looking at it too may also be, okay, you know, you just did X, all right, but was that very effective? So, you know, the takeaway for that with compliance professionals is that you really also need to look at more like effective ways to communicate and get the points across. And if it is, you have to ask yourself honestly, so have I really done my best? And if you have and you're fine with that, then I think, you know, that's settled. But you really need to try to give your best and not just to tick the box of I sent a memo, they did what they want. It's not my company. Because I find we're seeing that as well. One moment. Sorry, just admitting one other person. Now, in terms of inspection readiness, if you had to distill inspection readiness into just a few core principles, what should compliance officers and directors really focus on? So you've gotten that inspection notice. Hi, this is your pre-inspection questionnaire. We're coming to see you. What are the core principles that, you know, in that moment you need to be focusing
on? Well, first off, I would want to say if you're waiting to fix or remedy the institution only after you have received an inspection notice, you can pretty much say you're on your way to failing that inspection. The institution, or inspections, I should say, start with you, the licensees, where you should have policies in place that's fit for purpose, meaning it's policies for your institution, your business. And when you get an inspection notice, you should be in a position to say, no problem. I just want them to validate what we have been doing. However, if you have reached to the point where that is not the case, then by all means, you need, and right now, as I understand, you're doing more focus inspections. So you know exactly what area they're going to be covering. And so you would want to zero in on that area to ensure that, you know, all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. However, if you wait only until that time to make sure, it's a real problem for you because you have not done it over the years, over the time. And once you've gotten that notice, there's a time frame in which to submit certain documents that they're asking for, the Commission asks for. You ensure that these meet the deadline. You ensure that you provide what they ask. If you don't understand, reach out to them and they would guide you, explain to you what is meant by A, B, and C. However, as I mentioned before, as I started to discuss this area, you should be ready for an inspection at any time. And I too was on the inspection notice side at the bank. And one of my philosophies in the bank, if you catch me once, you're not going to catch me twice. But it meant taking a deep dive, a deep look into all the procedures that we had in place to ensure that these things are being followed and not wait for the inspection. You should be in a position to welcome an inspection. Now, that in that base. And we've had a few. Sure, here are the documents, here are the files. And so you're just waiting to see what was found. And quite frankly, Shamini, when I looked at your website, you have a guidance there. So, I know this is just a short session that we are having, but I'm sure if you go to OLIF website, there's a whole discussion on how to be prepared for inspection. And I find that it's very thorough. So please, if you haven't already, look there. But my advice is to always be inspection ready. And you do that by following your procedures, making sure that you're testing them and you're documenting what you have done. So be inspection ready.
Thank you. Now, we can pivot into that would be the best reality. And I have observed the institutions that have gone through more recent or frequent inspections, or not even necessarily frequent, but they've gone through inspections, because there's still some legacy institutions that have not yet gone through some. Those that have gone through the inspection, I find they have the muscle, they have the rigor, there's remediation in place, they're understanding the process. What would we say now? We're going to bridge into remediation. So you've not been inspected as yet. The compliance personnel, they've left this session. They're aware that, okay, we have these legacy files, the ongoing monitoring. That is a big thematic area at the moment. You're aware that ongoing monitoring has not actually been properly done across all of your legacy files. So you may have some files that have not been updated. So you've not gotten the inspection notice as yet. How would you recommend, and just through your experience, how would you recommend that the compliance officer addresses this, not only with the board, but also potentially with the commission?
Well, yes, I understand there may be legacy accounts, there are things that you need to do to remedy the files, but you need to have a plan in place. You need to know exactly how many companies you're dealing with and have a plan as to how you're going to remedy those files and have it properly documented. It's no point just talking, casually about it. Have a plan, set a schedule when you want to have it completed, and you assign responsibilities to people on your team. Get regular updates and see where you are. Make adjustments as you need to, and have that properly documented. So in the event, and quite frankly, you don't even need to wait for an inspection. Because if you have such a document, I'm sure the commission would be pleased to see that, yes, these are the proactive steps we are taking. This is what we have done. We are planning to have this completed by such and such a time. We have monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, updates, whatever. Those are things that would be helpful to the compliance officer and to the board and to the commission. It doesn't mean you will get fully compliant, but the commission would be happy to see that something is being done instead of waiting until the commission looks at these files and say, oops, you have a problem here. You know what the problem is. You have done a review and there's a plan in place to remedy these files. However, by the same token, you should be able then to look at new files and see that those are correct. I had a boss in the bank that used to tell me, you need to stop the bleeding. So from this point onward, tell yourself, this is what needs to be done. This is what we're going to do. So with inspections, when you look at those new files, they should be fine. They should be. So that's what I would say about that.
That's very helpful, because again, we always look at and encourage the remediation, having a plan, etc. But as you've mentioned, equally, whilst remediating it, it's important to ensure your new files are basically A plus, that you are executing as you need to with those. So we're down to our last 15 minutes, and this is where we're going to now pivot into just some careers and compliance. So as I've mentioned, Mrs. McCoy, you've been very instrumental for me when I started my journey in the BVI in compliance and regulatory. And actually, we were discussing this yesterday, that many of my questions to Mrs. McCoy at the time would be based on the Bank and Trust Companies Act and the regulatory code, but I'm the compliance officer. The reason I say this is because I'm finding that quite a few compliance officers approved are limited to the AML legislation. They may not be aware of what Section 72 of the regulatory code says about what you need to disclose to the commission, what the Bank and Trust Companies Act says about whether your shares can be transferred or disposed. And I think it will be very useful to touch on the difference, what the compliance officer's role is and what the money laundering reporting officer's role is, although we know that the commission can approve for the same person to be both. But it'll be good to touch on that.
Well, in the regulatory code, it clearly states what the compliance officer is responsible for. Me personally, especially, I think, especially for the larger firms, I mean, my personal belief is that they should have two separate persons doing those jobs, because the MLRO is really responsible for the AML piece, which is quite a lot. And the compliance officer, of course, would need to look at the entity as a whole. The reporting is something as simple as making sure that the license is on the wall. Those are things that need to be looked at, and not just the AML. As you mentioned to Chamonix, 10 years or more ago, more full inspections were done. And so you look at the entity as a whole, from A to Z in the institution. And now we are seeing more focus is on the AML side. But you should not, as a compliance officer, ignore everything else outside of the AML. It's equally important to ensure that these things are done correctly. They're done, period. As Chamonix mentioned, change in ownership. The reports, you make sure that they are being submitted timely, and that builds trust. You don't want to be consistently late with reporting to the commission. You just don't want that. You have a list of who submitted, and then you see ABC Limited did not submit. And you look back and it was the same ABC Limited every quarter. You want to build that trust with the commission. So it's very challenging, I would say, especially if you don't have, if you're not surrounded by a compliance team, and a lot of it rests solely with the compliance officer. It's challenging, and this is where compliance officers would need to articulate to the board what is happening, where you need resources, why you need resources, and document it, understanding that they want to see their bottom line for their shareholders. But, one big fine and your reputation could wipe that all out in very quickly. So these are things that you need to bring to your boards attention where you need resources to ensure that the compliance officer, you as a compliance officer, are covering everything that needs to be covered for the institution. While, like I mentioned, inspections may be now more focused on AML, which is very, very, very important. There are other things that are also just as important, or equally important, to ensure that the organization meet the requirements of the legislation.
And I think just to add here, aside from resourcing, I know some, just my ear to the ground with other compliance personnel. Sometimes the issue compliance officers face is, unfortunately, you're not aware of what's happening in your institution. Now, that in and of itself is a problem, but we also appreciate that not every institution's governance structure and how it runs is the same. But I think what's important for compliance officers is for you to be aware, first of all, what your role and obligation is, which is to safeguard the institution, ensuring that they're complying with what their broad scope regulatory requirements are. So whilst you may not be that person who is submitting the change in shareholding and those things, you as compliance officers should be aware that there is a change in shareholding that is occurring within your own entity. So these are things that, even with your board, that sort of discussion, it's just to ensure that you're communicating to the board the requirement for you to be aware of certain things, at least by the time it's gone to the commission, so that, there's that channel. So the way to do that would be to identify what are your obligations under the code, under the FSC Act. Explain it to the board, explain then what does that mean in practice. Again, it does not mean that you would necessarily be the one drafting the documents, but at least you need to have knowledge of what is going on. So that's very important for I find also newly appointed compliance officers. So it's not limited to your money laundering duties. So, Mrs. McCoy, for somebody, we're going to look at somebody starting in compliance and more mid-year. For somebody starting out in compliance, what do you think, in looking at the industry, just as you were exiting, and just from your knowledge, having interacted with so many people, what do you think are the most important skills or competencies that that individual should be focusing on early in their career?
Well, I'll step back a little bit and say that, I noticed that quite a few people do the ICA qualifications, but that's just the technical side of things. How do you apply this? This is where I think there may be some challenges. And in speaking to some compliance officers as well, not in my role at the commission, but people that I know, and you find that there's always, many times they are locking hands with the directors, maybe the MD. So those soft skills need to be developed. How do you listen first, hear what they're saying, and how you're able to articulate it to them at that level that, yes, I'm understanding what you're saying, however, ABC might be the case. So you need to develop those soft skills. What I would suggest also is to become knowledgeable in the institution that you're in. Now, you may be at institutional A and you want to move to institutional B. And sometimes, a lot of times, money is a driving force. However, you do a good job. I know perhaps this is not the way people think now, I don't know. And the money will come. But if you're in company A and you want to move to company B, avail yourself to what is in company A, because a trust company is a trust company, and become knowledgeable with the various aspects, from onboarding to reporting to FIA if you have to, get involved with what is happening. It's no longer a tick the box situation. So even if you have the ICA qualification, that's quarter of the battle. You need to have some experience. No need to say, well, I have my ICA qualifications now and I am going to apply for this position. Are you ready for it? Do you know, are you ready outside of just ticking a box? Do we have the passport, customer, the source of wealth, those things? Get involved. And so if you're in the department, that's in the compliance department, for example, but you're not the compliance officer, be willing to learn from that compliance officer. Be willing to stretch. Be willing to do what is asked of you. And the pushback, oh, that's not my job. It's not your job now, but it's going to help you be prepared for the next job. I was very happy when I went to the commission because in the bank I was into everything. But in the long run, it helped me to see things differently. Even going to the commission, I went to the commission to be the compliance inspection coordinator. So I knew the licensees from that end. But then when I went to the fiduciary, it was a different ball game. And so I have to learn that. For example, at the commission, in the inspection, you want to look, for example, who the owners are. You see the owners, it's matched back to the commission file, we're okay. But how were the owners, the shareholders, how were they approved? That's what I needed to learn. And I had some very good employees who were willing to share with me their knowledge from on the other side. But I was inquisitive. So I'm telling you, be inquisitive. Be willing to go beyond what is. And I know sometimes you might say, well, this is what I'm going to be judged on. But you're doing it for yourself. You're doing it for the next step. You're not going to be at company A all the time. You want to progress, and in wanting to progress, you need to really get involved. You need to be intentional with what you are doing. Be willing to do something outside of what meets the job description. It will help you. Trust me. I know. I know.
And how would we now adjust that to somebody who is already a tier 1 approved compliance officer, continuing, advancing themselves? What are some areas we need to focus on then? Some people think, well, I'm compliance officer, that's it. Are they furthering themselves? Are they doing more qualifications? Should there be soft skills, writing skills, communication skills they should be investing in?
Well, you need to be continuously improving. You need to, like I say, be inquisitive, find out what is happening, not just in the BVI, but what's happening, period, because the world with technology, it has shrunken. So you be inquisitive, like I said, find out what's going on, be able to communicate to the board properly. If you send something, for example, and you realize it didn't quite resonate with them, go back and find a mentor, find Chamonix, and you see what the college is then. The college is there. Improve. Don't operate. Well, I'm a compliance officer, and by the way, I heard Chamonix mention tier 1. Now it's just a compliance officer. So you're expected to operate as if you were a tier 3, which used to be, that designation a few years ago. But no, you are a compliance officer and you're expected to perform at that level. So continue, examine yourself, look to see, and ask yourself the hard questions. What am I uncomfortable with? and do that. I mentioned to Shamini yesterday, when I went to the college, I went to do one class, and it was effective business writing. And the reason why I went to do that class, because I was working with a lady, and she was very good at writing. So, if I want something, I give it to her. And she threatened to leave, and I'm like, "Ooh, okay, I need to fix this." So within yourself what your shortcomings are. Don't be afraid. Don't be as afraid to admit I need help in this area. There are lots of resources out there that you can avail yourself to, and continue to improve, and ask questions. Don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated. And no question is a stupid question. You're asking it, but believe you me, there are several more persons want that same answer. So continue to improve. Continue to, if you're not already, get an FSC mailing list. They publish quite a bit, even though I'm not there anymore. I go to their website every now and again to see what's going on. Into the Gazette, make sure that you know what's being published out there. Listen to the house. Just be involved, be inquisitive. And like I said, you're not doing it for the company, you're doing it for yourself. Because you would want to be not just a compliance officer for in the BVI, you want to be able to be the global compliance officer.
Yeah.
How good does that sound? Where you are the one that they're looking at for guidance. So don't limit yourself to just the BVI. Be inquisitive, continue to learn. And this environment, it's going to be constantly changing, and we need to evolve, we need to change with it. Okay?
Those are very wise. Thank you so much for that, Mrs. McCoy. And I hope, everyone, you really took that in, particularly those who are already compliance officers. Let's keep shooting even beyond that, as Mrs. McCoy mentioned, to even being a global compliance officer. And I think we need to see more BVI landers as well, who are global compliance officers, and, holding that, going really far and above and beyond. And in closing, now you're in retirement. I still do tease and give Mrs. McCoy a call now and then, shoot a message when I need feedback on certain things. And I really thank you for that. I had my moments too, very early on. Mrs. McCoy, I know this may sound like a silly question, but, and I would get the same reprimand that she's just given, that there's no silly question. So don't feel afraid to ask your peers. Don't feel afraid. If you're afraid to reach out to the regulator, and I've mentioned that on a previous toolbox, I find that as a compliance profession, we've lost that. We've lost what I used to benefit from back then, of calling other compliance colleagues and asking a question, what is X, or how do we do Y? And one of the reasons I'm having this platform is for us to start doing that again. We are here to support each other. So we should be able to reach out to each other with questions. A lot of people have similar questions, and we can put our heads together and find the answers. So Mrs. McCoy, now that you're in retirement and I took up your morning when you could be doing much more fun stuff, looking back at your wonderful career in regulation and supervision, what has been your greatest sense of professional fulfillment now looking back?
Well, looking back, I am proud of the service that I was able to provide, say, to the clients at the banks, and that followed me to the commission. There was a mindset that all clients, and at the commission, all clients are people like yourself. Anybody that called from the licensee, they are our clients. And I pride myself in providing that level of service that they deserve. Also, in terms of the growth, being at a commission, the one thing I would say all the time, one regret I have going to the commission is that it was not longer, because the wealth of knowledge, the training that you get from an environment like that is invaluable. I really, I just wish I had more time, but I'm on the other side now, which is retirement, and I continue to. You have a question, I don't mind providing that answer as best as I can. Understanding, though, I'm not speaking for the commission, I'm just speaking, and based on my knowledge, based on what I'm seeing, based on what's happening globally, I try to keep abreast, and this is one of the things that during my career you did that. Even going back to Chase, whatever was at Chase Bank, whatever was good for Chase Bank in New York was good for Chase Bank in the Virgin Islands. And so they provided that, wide scope for us to be able to function as if we were in New York. And those are the things that I really take away from both the bank and the commission. They give you an opportunity to grow. It's up to you if you just want to be complacent, be comfortable with where you are. But in both careers, the learning was tremendous, and it's so much so that now I'm retired, I continue to learn. So I would encourage you to do the same.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mrs. McCoy. This is really a well-received interview, a lot of golden nuggets. And for the participants, I just wanted to take this opportunity to inform you about our upcoming first in-person Gold Leaf seminar, which will be held on the 12th of March at the Arbitration Center. We will have participation by the BVI Financial Investigations Agency and the BVI Financial Services Commission. I have really spent time curating the sessions, which would include case studies, panel discussions, breakout sessions, where we're focusing on themes such as inspection readiness, enhanced due diligence, deficiencies in ongoing monitoring, where your record keeping is lacking. So we've spent, the Gold Leaf team, we've really spent time curating this so that it is very relevant, it is very practical. It's becoming one of those sessions, what I'm hoping that it's not one where you have to travel far and then you come back not necessarily feeling as fulfilled. We're dealing with specific BVI related matters to help the industry. So you're on our mailing list, and we will be tomorrow sending out the early bird information on this first in-person full-day compliance seminar on the 12th of March at the Arbitration Center. And it is going to be fully CPD accredited for that day. So you're going to get your CPD points for your ICA, your ACAMS, or any other professional body that you're with. So thank you for staying on, and thank you for being part of the Gold Leaf Compliance Toolbox series. As always, you can reach out to me if you have any questions, and Mrs. McCoy has offered as well if you have any questions. I will not share her details yet, and if she wishes, and if you reach out to me and you want that, or if you already have her information, you can do that. So thank you, everyone, and do enjoy the rest of your day.